that claim up. And then we've heard from New Zealand First. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to continue. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The member who will resume his seat in a minute. Thank you. The member who's just resumed his seat tells us that we live in uncertain times and there are things to be concerned about and worried about coming from Europe. I know, that's the perfect time to hock off a whole lot of assets. That's brilliant, brilliant economic lesson from Mr. Goldsmith to stand up in this House and say, in the middle of a global financial crisis, here's the bright idea. Mr. Goldsmith Sachs, here's the bright idea from the national government. Let's sell off assets into the most uncertain market we possibly could. No wonder Bill English can only guess at the price that we'll get for the assets, because he wants to sell it into a market where New Zealanders' future will be put at risk, not just for selling them off, but because the price they'll get will be appalling, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair, and we also heard from Mr. Goldsmith the importance of using the money that's gained from this for the future investment fund, the sort of, Logan's Run style future that will be brought to the world. Well, the problem with the future investment fund, Mr. Chair, is that the future investment fund involves selling off revenue generating assets to invest the money in schools and hospitals, things that are important but they're not revenue generating. Or perhaps that's how the national government sees them. Revenue generating schools, revenue generating hospitals. We've been there before, Mr. Chair, with the National Party, but the logic fails for Mr. Goldsmith. Sell off efficient, profitable organisations and claim a hoax on the country to say we're going to reinvest that money in schools and hospitals. Mr. Goldsmith, it's your government's job to invest in schools and hospitals no matter what, not just on the basis of selling off things that have been built up by past generations of New Zealanders. Take some responsibility on the national government side of this House and actually invest in schools and hospitals, and don't try and put a cruel hoax on New Zealanders that you're going to transfer this money across. Make the investment because it's worth doing. Don't sell off people's future generations' revenue-generating assets just to make that kind of hoax. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, the other element of Mr. Goldsmith's presentation that I'd like to mention is the question of the efficiency of the private sector in running some of these organisations, and the fact that there's just no way that a state-owned outfit could possibly be able to run at the level of efficiency that the Mr. Goldsmith's mythical private sector outfit could do so. Well, need I remind Mr. Goldsmith of KiwiRail and Air New Zealand, the companies that actually had to be bailed out by the Labor government because the private sector boards failed to run them efficiently. So the evidence doesn't really work for Mr. Goldsmith on this one. It doesn't really work for him. Also, we've heard from the Auditor General, we've heard from Treasury that these state-owned enterprises are currently run efficiently. They're currently well run. Why is it that Mr. Goldsmith wants to take something that's currently well run, efficiently well run, and generating revenue for New Zealanders and hock it off? It's because of ideology and because of failed economic policies from this government. And make no mistake, Mr. Chair, this bill is a testimony to the failure of this government. It's a testimony to the failure of this government to come up with any ideas to actually grow the economy. So having got no ideas to grow the economy, Mr. Henare wanted that mining in national parks. That's what he wanted, but the government didn't want to go ahead with that, so that idea went out the window. Then the economy was going to be grown by turning us into one big call centre for financial services. That idea went out the window. We had the Jobs Summit. There were more people at it than jobs created by it, but that doesn't matter. So Mr. Henare's government ran out of ideas completely, and they said, all right, we'll hock off the family silver. Well, the problem is with that argument, Mr. Henare, the problem with that argument is that it's sugar-hit economics. One sugar hit of somewhere between $5 and $7 billion, and then they are gone. It's sugar-hit economics from that side of the House. No economic plan. Try and find a way of generating a bit of money for a year, $5 to $7 billion, and then they're gone. And control of those assets are gone, Mr. Chair. So this bill, part one of this bill, actually puts in place the system to make sure that these assets can be sold. But what this government doesn't want to talk about today, Mr. Chair, what they don't want to talk about today is that by removing these from the State-Owned Enterprises Act, by taking these companies out via these clauses from the State-Owned Enterprises Act, they take away from New Zealanders the control that New Zealanders would expect to have over core infrastructure companies, over things that are absolutely vital to the future of our economy. And by taking them out of the SOE Act, Mr Chair, by taking them out of the SOE Act, that removes a number of key provisions. Firstly, it removes the social responsibility provisions that are in this Act. Now, members on the other side of the House have said, well, that's not really relevant, that's not that important. Yes, it is, Mr Speaker, because the whole point of having these as state-owned enterprises is the notion that they will be working in the interest of New Zealand, that the revenue will come back to all New Zealanders. Tony Ryle stood up in this House in this debate and said that this side of the House didn't have confidence in New Zealanders because we didn't want them to be able to buy into these assets. Well, Mr Ryle, we're the ones with confidence because we want them to be 100% owned by New Zealanders. That side of the House are the people who've lost confidence in New Zealanders because they want to hop off the shares to foreign buyers. This side of the House is one that's backing New Zealand 100%. But, Mr Chair, the reason why taking this out of the SOE Act is a problem is because by removing those social responsibility clauses, we actually have a situation whereby the things New Zealanders think that are important, the security of our infrastructure, the fact that there might actually be a social purpose for having electricity, for instance, provided in this New Zealander, is gone. It's undermined by this bill, but it's gone. That social responsibility clause won't be there. Neither will the requirements for good employer provisions. Now, that's actually covered by a number of amendments that have been put up by the Labor Party to try and remove these companies from this bill, to put them back into the State-Owned Enterprises Act. But actually, the good employer provisions in this bill are very important, Mr Chair. They're missing now. By Clause 3 in Part 1 of this bill, they are now missing. And the clause that's currently in the SOE Act says the impartial selection of suitably qualified persons for appointment. That's a key provision because these are agencies that should be working on behalf of New Zealanders. And by removing that clause by the bill, that's right, Mr Mallard, it's the crony clause. It's the clause that's taken out of this bill to enable the National Party to ensure that the agenda of privatisation can carry on, to ensure that the interests of the private shareholders in this company are going to be what really matters, not the New Zealand shareholders, because at the moment, under this Act, we know that there are good employer provisions, there are social responsibility provisions. New Zealanders can have confidence that these entities will be being operated in the best interests of all New Zealanders. Under this proposal, by not having those clauses in the bill, we no longer have that confidence. What we have, Mr Chair, is a situation where the National Party's cronies will be able to be appointed and the privatisation process will go on. Mr Chair, the other impact of Clause 3 of this bill also relates to the question around the treaty obligations. Now, the government's tried to come back on this. The government's tried to say, we made a mistake and we're now going to be coming back. But this bill does not protect Māori interests. And Mr Henare might want to take a call on this. Get up and tell the House. Why? Because he might actually be interested, as the chair of the Māori Affairs Select Committee, he might actually be interested in as the chair of the Māori Affairs Select Committee, he might actually be able to get up and tell this House how the future interests of Māori will be protected in this bill, because the clauses that sit there today are not there. By taking it out of the SOE Act, by taking it out of the provisions that New Zealanders know will actually protect them. No, that Mr Henare says that what we learned during this debate was that John Key didn't even understand how Clause 9 made it in to the SOE Act. He didn't even understand the importance that clause has had for protecting Māori interests in what New Zealanders own. There is nothing in this bill, that will protect the future interests of Māori in these assets. Mr Speaker, throughout Part 1 of this bill, what we see is the taking away from New Zealanders of all the protections that they have had for these assets that are meant to work on their behalf. What we see in this bill is Mr Henare would quite like to take a call and stand up rather than shouting continuously. He could stand up and take a call and say, how is it that New Zealanders are losing something that they 100% own, something that has been built up by past generations for an ideological sugar-hit piece of economics? This is a shameful bill from the National Party because it undermines core infrastructure. It takes away in Part 1 everything that it means for a piece of infrastructure and asset from a New Zealander's hands and takes it off and says it can be sold offshore. Mr. Chair, there is nothing in Part 1 of this bill that justifies selling this. There is nothing in Part 1 of this bill that actually says that New Zealanders can keep their birthright. It is a shameful piece of legislation.
I call Mojo Mathis. Order.